All right, good afternoon and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farms webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and the Iowa Nutrient Research Center and a faculty affiliate with the Iowa Learning Farms. It's my pleasure to get to moderate our webinar again today. Um, we have with us Dr. Francisco Arriaga, that is a professor and extension state specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's going to talk to us today about tillage management for soil conservation in row crop systems. This is right at the heart of what we started on 20 years ago with Iowa Learning Farms. So super important topic and certainly relevant to this webinar series. As always, if you have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Francisco at the end of his talk. And with that, the virtual floor is all yours.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Matt and the Iowa Learning Farms for having me here and sharing a little bit of the work I've been doing here in Wisconsin the last 12 years or so. So I'd like to begin just kind of set the ground on what is soil conservation, soil and water conservation. I mean, it's not a new concept. It's something we've been doing in the U.S. for quite a few decades. But I guess at the center of it is maintaining or improving the productive capacity of the land. And this is done by preventing or reducing degradation of the soil. So this ties nicely, obviously, with the management practices that we perform across the landscape in our fields. And it also kind of ties into the concept of soil health. So what I'm going to share with you, it's going to be a couple of different pieces. The first one is going to be related to tillage and nitrogen management, some work that we have been doing here in Wisconsin to look at nitrogen rates. And then segue from there and kind of start looking then at soil health concepts and production and a little bit of water quality tied into that, surface water quality. So it's always good, I think, to go and look back at a history. And this is sort of a neat patent back from 1891. It's just for a type of plow. But I guess the point that I want to make here is that manipulating the soil to improve its function, what we want after it, is not a new idea, obviously. We're trying to make soils into something productive, something that we can grow food, fiber, fuel, and feed, and use it to our advantage. But with that also comes certain things that happen when we manage the soil and we change it from perhaps its natural state in where it might be at somewhat of a balance. And so we introduce this management that we need for our benefit that will get us to a different balance, if you will. And that's where we kind of work in that. Where is that balance? Where is that new equilibrium that we need to look for? So in Wisconsin in particular, conservation tillage being a big piece, like I said, tillage has kind of lagged a little bit, and some of it has been done due to concerns about yield and management. One of the main things in Wisconsin that former colleague here at the university, Dr. Dick Wakowski, looked at was soil temperature and the effect of the residue. So how tillage affects residue on the soil surface and how that affects soil temperature and germination, all those kind of things, and then yield. And this is on corn. And in Wisconsin, currently, one of the recommendations that we have is to add more nitrogen if you have reduced tillage systems, which is not the same in other states. It varies by state a little bit, where in some states also advocate for reducing nitrogen rates once you reach a certain level of or have certain years of reduced tillage practices in your fields. And so we wanted to look at this in a little bit more detail here in Wisconsin and looked at the impact of tillage practices. So we set up a study at two different sites where we had different tillage practices. As you can see here on the left, it's what we were calling the conventional, which is chisel disc in the fall and a finisher in the spring. A strip till system here on the far right. And then in the middle, you see two no-till systems. The one here closer to the left, it's a traditional no-till system, and this is corn on corn type production. And the one on the right side in the middle here, this no-till, hopefully you can see my pointer. That one is a no-till where we actually came in the fall and removed as much as that stover as we could, and we ended up removing about, without disturbing the soil, we removed about 90% of that stover by mass, roughly. And so we were looking at different nitrogen rates, like as you can see here, from 0 to 300 in 75-pound increments. And like I said, 2 locations. I'll talk about them here a little bit more in a second. And so the 2 locations were Arlington and Lancaster, 2 fairly different soils, but representative of the state. Arlington, it's a molly soil, it's a Plano sill loam series. You can see on the inset graph on the bottom where that is located in south central Wisconsin. And then Lancaster, which is an alpha soil, and alpha soil is actually, so the molly soils, as you probably know, are soils that are derived usually from prairies. A lot of common, very common here in Wisconsin, but also in your state, in Iowa. And alpha soils are the most common soil order in the state here in Wisconsin. And those were derived more under like a forest type vegetation. But they're still quite common too in Iowa, as I'll show you in a second. So just to kind of put it in context, I went and said, well, how representative it is to Iowa? I know it's representative to Wisconsin. And so I went to the soil survey and started looking at, what series might be similar, looking at that information. And so lo and behold, it seems like there's quite a few acres. I think I forget now, I added it up, but it's quite a few acres. I think it's over 1 million acres in total when you combine these two, but mainly towards the eastern part of your state, but still representative of the conditions in the region. One big difference, and I would just want to put it and kind of be transparent about this, is that in Iowa, you actually have a longer growing season that we do in Wisconsin, even in the southwest corner of the state in the north central region. So those are some differences, I guess, there. So some of the things we did, since we were interested in temperature and the effect of temperature on plant development, early development, was we installed these little data loggers. You can see here on the right, they're called button loggers. They look like little batteries. And we put them in the row at 2 inches of depth and in some of our treatments to track canopy development. And what we did was that we took images. So we took digital pictures. Early on, we took them basically daily right after planting to see how that canopy developed. And then we continue on. As the plant emerged and then the development was slowing down, we reduced the frequency of those pictures. But we were looking at emergence and also canopy development early on. I won't dwell too much on this, just to show you an example, some data here of the soil temperature at 2 inches of depth in the row. On the left, Arlington, on the right, Lancaster. We did see some differences. In Arlington, the differences tended to be a little bit greater in that the no-till tended to have a lower temperature earlier in the season, probably likely due to the soil has more organic matter, isn't darker in color, so it has a greater solar radiation absorbance. Where in Lancaster, we did see that a little bit, but not as marked as in Arlington. As far as plant emergence or corn plant emergence, we did see some differences. It varied by year, obviously. Excuse me. But in general, the no-till with the residue on the surface tended to develop a little bit slower, but a lot of times it kind of caught up depending on the season and the location as well. So let's just get kind of like at the summary of this study. So the 5-year average response. So what you see here on the top is the nitrogen response at Arlington. And so you have on the vertical axis, you have corn grain yield. On the horizontal, you have nitrogen fertilizer. And then in the different colors, you see the different tillage systems, with chisel disc being in the blue and the no-till being in that orange, kind of reddish, and strip tillage in the yellow. And the gray is a no-till with the stover remove. Same thing on Lancaster at the bottom. Here on the right, we have the MRTN recommended rate for Wisconsin at these both locations, which is about 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and with a range of 155 to 180. In Iowa, I was just looking at that. Your recommendations are a little bit greater, and I think that's because of that larger or longer growing season that you have compared to us. But if you look at this in Arlington, the EONR range, the economic optimal nitrogen rate, was between 155 to 186 for these systems. In Lancaster, it was between 140 157, so it kind of jives a little bit and kind of matches the MRTN, so our current recommendations. We also try to look at nitrogen use efficiency. So this is Arlington, and this is looking at the agronomic efficiency. You can see the question on the top right, where you're just looking at the yield of the rate that you're interested in minus the yield at the zero rate, so your control, and then divided by the nitrogen rate at those two, that difference. So in Arlington, we see again the EONR here 155 to 186, that efficiency rate was between 0.6 and 0.53. And in Lancaster, not, I guess, too surprising after looking at yields and such, that efficiency rate was a little bit lower. So, been looking at these data for a while and kind of trying to figure out what's the best way perhaps to present this. And so I'm not an economist, but I attempted to do some economic analysis to look at what is the actual dollar and cents on this. So this is a partial budget for the 5-year average, and this is for Arlington, where on the bottom you have the nitrogen rate on the horizontal axis, and then on the vertical you have the partial return in dollars per acre for the 4 different tillage systems. And so on the bottom you see a little box here with some assumptions. So we use urea as our fertilizer, and so we have the price of urea, and then for the cost of tillage operation we use a custom rates for it, so that takes into account the labor, the fuel, all everything like that. In there, the cost might be lower if you're doing it yourself and you already own the equipment and so on and so forth, but this is sort of what we did to calculate these. So this only takes into account, again, nitrogen and tillage. So it doesn't take into account land rental. It doesn't take into account pesticide management. The pesticide management for like weeds, for example, was the same all across, so on and so forth. So it's just a partial budget. And so what we see here is that at EONR, at Arlington, the no-till, no-stover had the highest return at $639, almost $640, followed by the chisel disc, and then by the no-till with the stover, and the last was the strip tillage. When we look at Lancaster, same setup again. We see in this case that the returns are lower. We were less efficient. The system was less efficient with the nitrogen. But the highest returns were similar for strip till and the no-till, no-stover. So in both sides, that no-till with the stover remove, provided the highest returns. One thing to I guess word of warning might be is that there's been a lot of studies that were conducted in the late 90s and early 2000s when there was a lot of talk about the cellulosic ethanol, looking at stover. And this is one of the things that it was seeing, that in the early years of stover removal, you would see a boost in yields. And perhaps it's because you're allowing that organic matter in the soil mineralize a little bit more or faster, and you would see that. But then after 6, 7, 8 years, then you start seeing decline. So this is something that is interesting. I think it's a kind of an interesting, perhaps, spin on some future research, but also keeping in mind that long-term productivity might be affected. So I guess the take home for this work is that the weather and the climate, obviously, and the soil affected a little bit the nitrogen fertilization, and the tillage system was also a component in there. It appears that soil temperature was an important factor with this, not only from the corn emergence, but perhaps maybe even nitrogen mineralization in the soil of that organic matter. One thing I want to point out, one of the weaknesses that I see now, hindsight is 2020 with this project, is that we use urea. It was straight urea. They didn't have any inhibitors or any coating or anything else, and we broadcast it. So perhaps results might be a little bit different. You're using something like UAN, which has been shown to be more efficient. It's used more efficiently than nitrogen source by corn crops. But it appears that reduced tillage in no-till and strip till, for example, could be viable options here, at least in Wisconsin. But I would imagine that in Iowa, perhaps is even more. I did similar work when I was based with the USDA Agricultural Research Service in the southeast of the U.S. And reduced tillage was very advantageous there, where we have big growing seasons, and we were able to combine it with other practices such as cover cropping. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about tillage now and functioning in general. So when I say function, I like to think about health. I think that's what the concept of soil health gets at, is that we're trying to get a function out of the soil. So I'm going to start us with a study by Nunez and others with other colleagues out of USDA-ARS. We're looking at tillage intensity and soil health, mainly biological parameters. And so what they did was what is called a meta-analysis. So they went to the literature and found work that was conducted by others, and then they extracted the data to then have a more comprehensive data set. And you can see they had over 300 studies that they included in their work, and you can see the distribution here across the U.S. on that map on the bottom right. And so one of the conclusions they have when you look at this paper is that reducing tillage intensity improves soil organic carbon, which over the long term, that's what we would expect. Also biological activity. So obviously increasing organic carbon, that's promoting biological life and activity, and labile carbon and nitrogen fractions in the soil. And they also noted that these changes were more noticeable towards the top of the soil, which again makes sense because that's where the bulk of the organic matter tends to be, or the organic carbon. However, if you stop and kind of look in a little bit more detail, some of the subtleties in the data that they have, there's a little bit more to the story, I think. And so what I'm showing you here is that from that study of Nunez and others, is the response ratio relative to moldboard plow. So it's comparing certain practice to moldboard plow. So moldboard plow being the highest disturbance, if you will. And in this case, they were comparing, so you can see down here, to conventional tillage. So that's CP, NT no-till, or reduced tillage. And then the PER in the graph, it's permanent vegetation. And depending on the study and the site that they use. So that's what you see. So I'm just going to walk you through this figure here on the top left first. So you see the CP, NT, and PER. This top row is the topsoil, as it says there, top, and that is equivalent to about 0 to 6 inches of depth, roughly. It varies a little bit because of the different studies doing slightly different depths. And so as you go down, then what you see is a different tillage depth. Then the first column here, it's the soil organic carbon response ratio. So this is just looking at soil organic carbon. Then microbial biomass carbon and microbial biomass nitrogen. And so the way these figures work is that if you're in this line that it's highlighted by the 1 here, if you're right on top of it, there's no difference between that practice, in this case, let's say conventional tillage, to moldboard plow. If it's to the right, there is a positive effect from that practice. And if it's to the left, there's a negative effect relative to the moldboard plow. So as you can see here on the top, soil organic carbon, you see that with the tillage intensity, there was a positive response from the conventional tillage, but it's very close to that moldboard plow. As you go into no-till, there is a difference to moldboard plow, but not as much to a less, I guess, intense tillage system, like that conventional tillage, if you will, like a chisel plow, let's say. And then the permanent vegetation, not surprisingly, has the highest amount of organic matter. And then as you go down in that profile, the different depths of these studies, you see that then the difference with the moldboard plow and the agro ecosystems, basically there's none, and the permanent still some. And then as you go down, you see the same kind of effect. And then you look at microbial biomass carbon, you see somewhat similar, not as maybe as drastic as soil organic carbon. So you see these differences here. It's kind of like what that general conclusion that I read you. But I guess one thing to note here is that differences here between tillage systems are less noticeable. So in order to get a big difference between managements, you had to compare permanent vegetation to an agricultural system. But the other thing, and this is the next slide, is that the larger differences between agricultural systems were associated with other management aspects. And I'll give you my take home here is that there's no silver bullet. A lot of times we're looking for a single practice that is going to fix all of our problems. But the message here is that we need to think about stacking practices. It's not just about one practice. So it's not just about tillage, but perhaps cover crops. So on the top graph here, we see the response ratio. And this is no-till versus moldboard plow. So what we see here with the cover crop is a no-till versus that moldboard plow with no cover and cover. And lo and behold, what you see here now when you introduce the use of a cover crop in the no-till system, we see a bigger difference than just comparing that no-till system to the moldboard plow in that sense. On the bottom, we see residue removal. I talked about that here in a second, where you have high removal, moderate removal, and no removal. And again, it's not just about the tillage because this is all no-till compared to the moldboard plow. It's also about other management practices. So the residue it's very beneficial. That additional residue added by a cover crop, that living root, is also very important for all of these effects. So I want to segue a little bit, and I'll go kind of quick about this. So we did a similar study here, again, at Arlington, Lancaster, looking at this kind of same setup as Nunez that I showed you a second ago, where we looked at two different systems in kind of did a similar thing. We look at natural, what we would call an enhanced agricultural system. So it was a no-till with a cover crop in Arlington. In Lancaster was a long-term rotation of corn, soybean, corn, followed by oats, and oats alfalfa mix, 2 years. And so there was only tillage on that system in Lancaster, was only tillage after corn. And so there's a rotational tillage system, if you will. And so we looked at a whole battery of different soil health parameters, soil health indicators, 31s overall. So here I have in bold 3 that I'm going to share with you: soil organic matter, water stable aggregates, and then ACE protein, or the autoclavable citrate extractable protein, which is an indication of organic nitrogen in the soil. And what I have here, similar setup than the graph from Nunez that I showed you. On the left is organic matter, on the right is ACE protein. But this is the actual values. It's not a relative comparison here at different depths. And if we look at the 0 to 2 and 2 to 4 inches, we see again kind of the same thing we saw in Nunez, that agricultural systems are going to be closer to each other, and then these other so-called natural systems or non-agricultural systems are it's farther apart. However, you look at the ACE protein again, and the difference are less pronounced in there. Similar situation with aggregate stability. I guess my take-home message, or the reason I wanted to show you this, are these relationships here, where I have soil organic matter on all these graphs on the horizontal axis relative to total carbon, ACE protein, aggregate stability, active carbon, so another fraction of carbon. And we see that organic matter relates very closely to all of this. So the point being is that soil organic matter is a very good indicator, and we typically get that information, and you might already have an archive perhaps with the routine soil samples that hopefully you're all taking. And so that's a take-home message there. So I'm going to segue now and want to talk a little bit about soil health and water quality, because a lot of times, at least in my state, it seems like a lot of people equate soil health to better quality. Again, I'll give you, again, my 2 cents on my take-home message right off the bat is that not necessarily. So when we think a lot of times in soil health, and in the context we've mainly been talking about soil health in general, has been more related to agronomic performance, so yield and productivity, and not necessarily water quality. So there are certain situations where a parameter or indicator that we have, or thinking about it in agronomic for agronomic purposes, might not necessarily translate into better water quality. And obviously that relates to the management as well. So I'm going to share with you some information that we have from research that we conducted here, where we're looking at cover crop on corn silage systems. So obviously, we grow a lot of corn for silage. And so we've done a series of comparisons of cover crop and no cover crop, manure injections, all kinds of different things too, type of manure application, injected surface application versus low disturbance injection. In this case, I'm just going to show you the tillage and cover crop kind of interaction here. So we have an enhanced system again, which is a no-till with a cover crop, and a traditional tillage system, which is a fall, chisel, spring. On both of these tillage systems, we have cover and no cover. In this case, is winter rye. And so we did find actually that the cover crop, as you can see here on the top graph and the bottom graph, especially the bottom top graph, it's biological available P, was successful. So using a management practice that helps soil health reduce phosphorus loads and losses in these systems. Same thing on the bottom, it's total phosphorus load at different times of the year. On the top is average across the years. And we see that there's some benefit to it. But there's a little bit more to the story always. So the way we measure these losses is that we use a rainfall simulator. Doing edge of field is very costly. And so we did the rainfall simulator at 3 times of the year, because we were interested in looking at this aspect of the stage of the cropping system. So you see here in April, June, and October. So in April, we have not seeded our corn crop there yet. So the system might look something like this, as you see in the picture on the right. And the different lines, what you see is that there's two that are grouping on top of each other, two on the top and two on the bottom. And what that relates to is actually to the cover crop, not the tillage. So the top two are with cover crop, no till and conventional, and the bottom, no cover crop, no till and conventional. However, when we come to June, what happened with the conventional tillage with the cereal cover crop or the winter rye is that we have performed an additional tillage practice and we have incorporated that residue. So there's very little residue on the surface. And so what we see then that the reduction in runoff it's more related to that surface cover, as you can see here on the right, is the no-till with the cover on the surface, and then where we see more runoff, more cumulative runoff on the graphs here on top, on the lines on top, it's where we don't have that cover crop, including the no-till with no cover crop, and then the conventional till with cover crop, but that was already incorporated. And then when we look in October, we see that biomass is very important, but the amount of biomass is very important. So we have a little bit of cover in there, about 20-25% from that cover crop. And again, this is corn for silage, so there's very little residue from the corn. So we see that very little residue doesn't translate then in reductions on infiltration. Again, it's not just about the single practice, but there's multiple practices that come into play where we're looking at systems for conservation, soil conservation. So because of all this work, we actually conducted our own meta-analysis where we look at tillage and then this effect with cover crop. So what we did is that we looked at studies in North America that looked at runoff the entire year. So we wanted the entire year annual losses and with the residue. So we identified sites that had tillage with less than 30% residue, others with no till less than 30%, and the same thing then tillage with more than 30 and then greater than 30. And we use a pasture sort of as a comparison. And so this is sort of the distribution of where the data, the sites were collected in total. Studies span between 1968 to 2019, almost 1,600 site years in total included in here. Obviously, the way that the data landed is that there was more studies and work done with till type systems, as you can see here, 612 versus no till or 73. So just for, again, full disclosure, it's not a balanced setup, but that's sort of the best data that we were able to gather. And again, the setup on this graph, it's similar to the one I showed you in Nunez. In this case, we're looking at percent effectiveness. The zero line, we were using a zero line in this case. It's here horizontally. And then on the bottom, we have different parameters. Here's the key for that. R is runoff, sediment, dissolved nitrogen, particular nitrogen, so on and so forth. And again, we use sort of a percent effectiveness compared to a baseline. So in this case, if we're above that zero line, we had a positive impact from that practice. In this case, we're comparing less than 30% residue for no-till and tillage. So we're comparing the tillage versus the no-till and less than 30%. And so what we see that, yeah, the no-till helps in a lot of parameters. For example, sediment losses, total nitrogen losses in runoff, so on and so forth. But then we see this dissolved phosphorus where there's a lot more dissolved phosphorus with the no-till. And that kind of goes in line with, perhaps phosphorus stratification in the systems and having greater than dissolved losses in that manner. And I just want to point out that dissolved phosphorus tends to be a more bioavailable form for aquatic life, algae blooms, and so it's something of concern. So now let's compare and look at the impact of residue. So now we're looking at tillage with less than 30% residue and tillage with greater than 30% residue. And we see actually very little difference in these parameters of water quality in the surface water. But when we compare now tillage with less than 30% residue now to tillage with greater than 30% residue, now we see that all the parameters are above that line or right at that zero line, and that dissolved phosphorus actually has made a significant gain in reduction on that dissolved losses. So again, it's I guess the idea of stacking practices, not just a single silver bullet out there that's going to help us. The other work that we have done, and I just briefly mentioned this, is to try to figure out how much biomass do we need from a cover crop to reduce sediment and phosphorus losses and runoff. So we use different seeding rates and we looked at compare different cover crop canopy structures. Um, long story short, for the work we've done, about 1,500 pounds of dry biomass on the surface seems to cut losses by 50%. I mentioned also in Wisconsin, we have a lot of manure. So our manure management is quite important. And what I want to point out here is just basically this graph in the middle, this total phosphorus loss in runoff, where we're comparing down here. You can see all those different types of application of manure, dairy liquid manure, two cover crop systems. So one of them is surface applied, another one is a deep injection down to like 8 inches of depth. Another one is a low disturbance, so it's near the surface. But what is interesting here is that we have a no cover crop, no manure control, which is these red asterisks here. And look at the difference. So we actually have more losses when we didn't have a cover crop, but we did not apply manure to the soil relative to system, the same soil where we had a cover crop and we did apply manure. So I think that's quite interesting. It shows the value of cover cropping and residue on the surface. All right, so I'm going to segue here quick and kind of getting towards the end of what I want to share with you, so we can open it up to questions. And it's a little bit related to soil health and human health, and this is sort of maybe my biased approach to it. But I think a lot of times we're thinking of soil health sort of the same way we're trying to think of a human health. So with human health, and I'm going to put myself on the spot here, we have certain indicators and certain things that we can go to the doctor, to our physician, and they can run some tests, sort of, blood pressure, cholesterol levels, sugar levels in your blood after fasting, temperature, right? In the case we have a fever or not. So, and so it kind of gives us an idea of how we're functioning. And so there are certain parameters and certain ranges that shows us that. And so we can do certain things. For example, blood pressure. I actually suffer of high blood pressure, so I take a medication every day to keep that in check. So, is that something we can do? There's management. Cholesterol, you can do diets, there's pills, there's different things, so on and so forth. However, knowing that perhaps I have high blood pressure, my cholesterol tends to be borderline, does that give you an indication of how good an athlete I am in a certain sport? It doesn't, right? And so when we're talking about soil health, we're kind of thinking more of that athlete. Do we have a thoroughbred type soil, or how do we get it there? So I think we need to kind of change maybe our perspective a little bit and kind of put it in context. And I think it's relatively simple or easy to do, in that when we're looking at soil health and soil functioning, we should start thinking perhaps first, what is the goal that I'm after? What are the things that I need out of this? And then kind of start from there, and then kind of start sorting out what is important then as far as like management. How can I track then the benefits perhaps of that management in things that are happening as I move forward, and then tweak as you go. So after saying all of this, one of the questions that sometimes might come up is reduced tillage and no-till worth doing it? And I say absolutely it is. But again, we need to keep in mind other management aspects, other things, in sort of these concepts too, or this idea of soil health as I presented it. So I want to finish off though sharing this piece of data here, information. This data, excuse me, it's from the Soil Health Institute. So Soil Health Institute, it's based out of North Carolina. A lot of you probably are familiar with their work, but they do work nationwide. So a few years ago, they conducted a survey of 100 farms across the U.S. In on this survey, they were trying to get economic data, economic information, to see what soil health practices farmers were seeing the best results, and what information was available. And so what I have here is just a snippet of states that are near us. So it's Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota. Unfortunately, they did not collect data in Wisconsin. So I'm just going to present this 3 years. There's actually more data available from other states on the comprehensive. So this is just a snippet that I did. So on the first column, you see the state, and then on the bottom there, So you see the average and the total. So I forgot to mention South Dakota. Number of farms interviewed per state, acres per farm, no-till acres. So we see that a lot of these farms actually had a large percent of no-till. Acres that were in cover crop, we see that then that actually drops, that we see a decrease. So we go from 82% of adoption of no-till to about 44% adoption of cover crop. And then they looked at reported change in yield. So out of all these operations that they looked at, 68% or about 70% of them reported an increase in yield. The lowest report perhaps was in Minnesota, with only 55% of those interviewed reporting that. But none of them, at least in these states, reported a decline from adoption of these practices. And again, they were calling in them or looking at them as soil health practices. And then they also asked about increase in net income per acre. And you can see here for corn and soybean, these two columns on the average about $54 per acre, soybean about 43 or so. So it seems like, at least from this survey, and again, it's not perfect data either, but it gives us a kind of an insight on perhaps some benefits on the production side of things, and not also negating the other benefits that we discussed related to surface water quality. And with that, I guess we'll open it up for questions. And so if you have further questions that you cannot get in the chat, my email's there at the bottom, f.arriaga@wisc.edu. That's my phone number for my office. Feel free to leave me a voicemail if I don't answer, and I'll get back to you. And with that, Matt, I think that's all I have for now, and maybe we can open up for questions.
Yep. Let's go through I'll help get through the last few slides. We do have a few questions, but we'll probably have time for a few more. So maybe you can advance the slides, Francisco. All right. If you watch this webinar live and need to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, and her email is alenaw@iastate.edu. Again, alenaw@iastate.edu. Email her by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Let's go to the next slide. If you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. Only one survey response is needed for all 2024 webinars. So if you've done that, thank you so very much. If not and are willing to, please scan the QR code or go to the iowalearningfarms.org/survey to complete that. Again, we greatly appreciate it. Yep, next slide now. So put a plug in for Deanne Presley, professor of agronomy at Kansas State University. And she'll be talking to us about on-farm soil health assessment results, lessons learned. So kind of again to soil health, which is great. And then maybe I think there's one last slide. If you or maybe two slides, but if these webinars are all archived, you can find them on the Learning Farms website or on the Iowa Learning Farms YouTube webinar channel. And then now we'll go to the last one. Put in a plug for the Regen PGC perennial ground cover webinar series. It's coming up Tuesdays, starting January 14th, series of 5 webinars there. So definitely tune in to those that are routine attendees of our ILF webinars. Know that we've had a few Regen PGC included, Dr. Rahman and Dr. Anderson. So please tune into those. Somebody asked, maybe we can go back to the CCA credit slide, Francisco, and there we are. Oh, one more. Maybe one more back. There we go. Okay, so that's up there. I'll get to the questions now. First question was, have you looked at soil temperatures, or the question was on soil temperatures and indicating surely the time of day is important for that temperature, and that tilled soils might be colder at night and warmer during the day. Could no-till, in other words, no-till could be more could it be more friendly to corn germination at certain temperatures where maybe we don't have that swing of highs and lows?
Oh, I have not looked at that, I guess, that variability, but that's an interesting concept. I know there's a few farmers here in Wisconsin that are very, um, I wouldn't say concerned, but they've been trying to look at what's the variability within a row and then between rows. And so this could be something related to that, the temperature. So yeah, so if you have something that it's perhaps more of an even surface, you should have more of an even temperature gradient, I guess, across that surface. So I have not looked at that directly, but that would make some sense. Yes.
Um, you're where you've looked at some of the uh, return on the no-till, no stover system. Did that include the cost of baling or somehow removing the stover?
Uh, Good question. And I'm trying to think back if we did. I think we did, but I better go
Okay.
look back and make sure that we included that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Um,
And I guess the profit from that, I guess, if you're trying to sell it as bedding or feed
that
or what have not too.
that's exactly right. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Um, there another one here is that are there clear trends in tillage practices and crop residue management? Is more intensive tillage always associated with greater retention of crop residue in the field?
I'm wondering if the question, I'm not sure if I understand
Yeah.
100%. So meaning to say that if you have crops like corn where you have more residue accumulation, you have a greater use, I guess, if you will, of intensive tillage practices.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, there's some of that. It seems at least again, in Wisconsin that those growers that are more of a grain production system type based, and they're corn, they tend to do more tillage and use tillage practices that perhaps are more aggressive, if you will. Um, and so yeah, I think there is some of a relationship there, but one of the problems I think we have in the state is a problem manure and especially liquid dairy manure. And that manure needs to be incorporated or somehow kind of managed in a way that we reduce losses. And so that will create some disturbance. And so that's why we've been trying to do some work, me and colleagues, on looking at systems that like those LDI, low disturbance injectors, and
Hmm.
things like that, that get us what we need, but yet we get some benefit from leaving that soil as intact as possible.
Yeah.
However, I think just to kind of maybe digress too, I think there's a lot of benefit to rotational tillage and doing some tillage, certain phases of your rotations or certain time of the year to perhaps, if you have nutrient certification and things like that, or you need to incorporate lime. I know that's a topic that some farmers that I'm working with currently here interested in going no-till, and they have gone in no-till, but they did not correct their pH. And so now, how do we do this without setting back and doing tillage? So,
Okay.
yeah.
Great. Okay. There, somebody indicated that a primary concern is with no-till is perceived risk of delayed planting date. So they wondered, is there data to show when soils are ready for planting based on tillage, no-till versus chisel?
Not that I've seen just directly like a table that it tells you this delay, so many days or what have not. But yeah, that is correct. There's usually a delay, just waiting on the soil temperature. But I mean, a lot of these systems we were planting, and it might sound a little late for you in Iowa, but we're planting, mid April a lot of times,
Okay.
early April. Latest was maybe the first week in May.
Okay. How large in acres are your two sites?
In acres, I mean, it's a plot study is replicated, so in acres, they're not super big. The plots we're using different tillage equipment to kind of fit that need. If I had to guess from the top of my head, they are about an acre and a half, I think.
Okay.
But
All
that's
right.
counting alleyways and other things to get the tillage to the right depth and all that kind of stuff.
Okay, great. And there, maybe last one here is, does adopting cover crops influence farmers' decisions regarding the type of tillage practices they may use?
I think to a degree, it also depends on what kind of system they're working on. again, in Wisconsin, we have a lot of livestock. So some farmers will grow a cover crop and then they'll let it grow a little bit longer in the spring and harvest that as a forage crop. Some may do some tillage to it or just plant directly into it. Those that maybe are starting with the cover crops and are kind of getting more into reduced tillage and no-till, they might terminate that cover crop earlier and then use herbicides to do that. So I think there's a whole mix a little bit on and it's more of the concern the rest in the surface. So I think most farmers are trying to go to a reduced tillage type system, and so if they're incorporating now cover crops into their management, they're adopting it slowly, little by little.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. I think with that, Francisco, thank you very much for an excellent webinar. Gave us all lots to think about. Really appreciate your willingness to share your information today. And again, this is a slide. If you need a CCA CEU, email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And please tune in next week for Dr. Presley to talk about soil health then on some work in Kansas. So with that, Francisco, I'll give you the last word if you have any last parting comments.
No, thank you all, and hope you have a good holiday season.
All right. Thanks. Thanks very much.
All right. Bye.
All right. Yep. We stopped the recording. Thanks so much, Francisco. It's good to see you. And
Yeah,
thank
good
you
to see
very
you too.
much for all the information.
Yeah, not a problem.
Yep.
Thank you for
You
having
bet.
me. Yeah,
You bet.
talk to you
Take
later.
care.
All
Yep.
right,
Bye.
bye.